The autumn of 1943 was cold in the Central Pacific, colder than a boy from Ohio would have guessed the tropics could be at night. Roger Bond was 20 years old. He wore the wool of a quartermaster on the signal bridge of the aircraft carrier Saratoga, and he was counting. He counted with his eyes first. Then, when the numbers stopped making sense to him, he counted again with his finger, moving it left to right across the horizon, the way a child counts the birds on a wire. 1, 2, 3. Gray slabs of steel rode the swell around him, each one throwing its own white wake, each one launching aircraft into the dawn in a rhythm so constant it had become the sound of the ocean itself. 4, 5, 6. The carriers stretched further than any single pair of eyes was meant to see. Bond turned his head to the port beam and kept counting. He turned to starboard and counted more. 7, 8, 9, 10. He was breathing shallow now. His hands had gone still on the rail. 11, 12, 13. 13 American aircraft carriers, steaming in a single formation, in a single ocean, on a single day. And there were more of them beyond the horizon. He knew there were. The signal traffic told him so. Roger Bond stood on that bridge, and he could not quite make his mind hold the number. Because Bond had been there at the bottom of this thing. He had served through the black autumn of 1 year earlier, the autumn of 1942, when the United States Pacific Fleet had exactly 2 functioning aircraft carriers left in the entire ocean. 2. The Saratoga, the ship beneath his feet, and the Enterprise. Everything else was on the seabed, or bleeding oil in a dry dock 1,000 miles away. 1 year. 2 carriers to 13. He would later reach for a word to describe what he felt in that moment, and the word he chose was awesome, not the way we use it now. The old sense of the word, the sense that means something close to terror. And 8,000 miles away, in a room in Tokyo, 3 years before this morning, an old admiral had told a prime minister that this exact horizon was coming, almost to the ship. Hold that image. Hold the young man on the bridge with his hand frozen on the rail. Because the story I want to tell you is not really about Roger Bond. It is about the men on the other side of that ocean. The Japanese admirals who had planned this war. The men who had launched the aircraft over Pearl Harbor. The men who had told themselves a very specific story about how it would all go. And the question I want to answer is this. What did they think when the American carriers stopped dying? When they sank 1 and 3 more appeared? When they sank 3 and a dozen more came up over the horizon like tide itself? Because the deepest, quietest, most devastating fact of the entire Pacific War is not that America won. It is the speed. It is how fast the United States replaced what it lost, and how completely Japan could not. To understand what those admirals felt, we have to go back. Not to Pearl Harbor, further back than that. We have to go back to a room in Tokyo in the autumn of 1940, more than a year before the first bomb ever fell on Battleship Row. The room belonged to Prince Fumimaro Konoe. He was 49 years old that autumn, the Prime Minister of Japan, a man from one of the oldest aristocratic families in the country, thin and pale, with the exhausted eyes of a man who had already begun to understand that the war party in his own government was going to have its way whether he wished it or not. Sitting across from him was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was 56. He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the operational head of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was small, compact, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an old wound at Tsushima in 1905. He had lived in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen with his own eyes the steel mills of Pennsylvania and the automobile plants of Detroit. He knew exactly what America was. Kono asked him the question, "If we go to war with the United States, what will happen?" Yamamoto did not soften it. He looked at his prime minister, and he answered, "If I am told to fight," he said, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months, or perhaps a year. After that, I have no confidence at all." The words are recorded in Konoe's own memoirs, published after the war. They are not a Hollywood invention. They are what the man said. And I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 6 months. Because you already know, if you know anything about this war, that the Battle of Midway ended on June 7th of 1942. Which was exactly 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto told his prime minister exactly how long the good times would last, almost to the day, more than a year before a single shot was fired. He was not guessing, he knew. Now, here is where the popular story goes wrong, and I have to be honest with you. Because you have almost certainly heard another quotation attributed to Yamamoto, the famous one, the one where he says that all Japan has done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. I have to tell you, as directly as I can, that there is no evidence Yamamoto ever said those words. That line first appears in the 1970 film, Tora. The producers of that film could never produce a letter in which the words appeared. Neither of the 2 great biographies of the man contains the line. It is, by every serious standard of evidence, a screenwriter's invention. And I refuse to use it because the truth is worse. The truth is that Yamamoto did not need to be awakened. He was awake already. He had been awake the entire time. He looked his prime minister in the eye and told him in flat, professional, unromantic Japanese that the war they were about to fight could not be won past the first year. And they fought it anyway. That is the tragedy at the center of this entire story. And it is a colder tragedy than the movies would like it to be. While Yamamoto sat in that room and warned his prime minister of what was coming, On the other side of the Pacific, a decision had already been made, a decision that would shape everything. The date was July 19th, 1940, 17 months before Pearl Harbor. In a hall in Washington, a president in a wheelchair signed his name to a piece of paper. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was 58 years old. And what he signed was called the Two-Ocean Navy Act. A month earlier, the chief of naval operations had gone before Congress and asked for $4 billion. He had asked to increase the combat strength of the United States Navy by 70% in a single stroke. 257 new ships, 1,325,000 tons of new warships. And of that tonnage, 200,000 tons had been allocated, specifically and by law, to aircraft carriers. The congressman whose name was on the act was Carl Vinson. He was 57 years old, a stubborn Georgian who had spent decades in the House of Representatives thinking about naval power. And when he stood on the floor of the House to argue for the bill, he said something that tells you where the American mind had already gone. The modern development of aircraft, he said, has demonstrated conclusively that the backbone of the Navy today is the aircraft carrier, the backbone. In 1940, before a single American carrier had fired a shot in this war, before Pearl Harbor, before Midway, before Roger Bond had ever set foot on the Saratoga, the backbone. And here is the fact that reframes everything you thought you knew about the Pacific War. By the morning of December 7th, 1941, 5 aircraft carriers of the new Essex class had already been laid down. Their keels were already resting on the building ways of 5 American shipyards. The steel was already being cut and welded into hulls before the Japanese aircraft ever appeared over Battleship Row. The lead ship, the Essex herself, hull number CV9, had been ordered in July of 1940. Her keel had been laid on April 28, 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. Read that sentence again. 8 months before the war began, the Americans had already started building the ship that would give her name to the class that would win it. The United States did not react to losing its carriers by building new ones. The United States had already decided in peacetime to build a navy large enough to fight in 2 oceans at once. And the ships were already coming. The war would only decide where they went. And there is one detail from this story that I want to give you now, because it is the most emotionally powerful piece of the entire American war effort. And it is the piece the popular version of history gets exactly wrong. You have heard, perhaps, that when the great American carriers were sunk in 1942, the Navy honored them by giving their names to new ships. When the Lexington, hull number CV2, went down at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, an Essex-class hull under construction was renamed Lexington. She became CV-16. When the original Yorktown, CV-5, was lost at Midway in June of 1942, an Essex hull was renamed Yorktown. She became CV-10. When the Wasp, CV-7, was torpedoed and sunk in September of 1942, a new Wasp arose to carry the name. She became CV-18. When the Hornet, CV-8, the carrier that had launched the Doolittle raid, was lost at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October of 1942, a new Hornet was named in her honor. She became CV-12. 4 ships died in a single year. 4 ships rose to carry their names back into the same ocean where the originals had gone down. It is a beautiful story, and I have to tell you the part the beautiful story hides. Those 4 replacement ships were not begun as replacements. They were already on the building ways. They were already ordered. They were already taking shape in the yards before their namesakes ever sank. The Navy did not lay their keels in a fury of grief. The Navy renamed ships it was already building. The dead did not summon the living. The living had been there all along, waiting only for a name. The honor was real. The men who did the renaming meant every bit of the symbolism. But the desperate, reactive, build them to replace the fallen scramble that the legend imagines simply did not happen. It did not need to. The ships were coming anyway. And this, right here, is the fact that hangs over everything else in this story. Because when the Japanese admirals planned their war, they were not gambling that American industry would fail to respond. They were gambling against a fleet that was already under construction. A fleet whose dimensions were a matter of public record, passed into law by an act of the United States Congress, which they could have read about in any newspaper. They knew the ships were coming. Yamamoto, in his room with Konoe, knew the ships were coming. That is what his 6 months meant. That is why he had no confidence in the second year, because he could count as well as any American, and he had done the counting already. The question that haunts this story, the question I want you to carry with you into the next part of it, is not why the Japanese admirals were shocked. The question is why, when the admiral who would plan the war looked his prime minister in the eye, and told him plainly that it could not be won, the men who ran his country picked up the sword anyway. The 5 keels were already on the ways. The law was already written. The steel was already coming. And in a shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, in a construction office that had never built a warship in its life, a man named Henry Kaiser was about to change what the word shipyard meant. But that is the next part of the story. The Essex was a giant, 27,000 tons of standard displacement, 872 feet from bow to stern. She was designed to carry 90 aircraft into battle and to bring most of them home again. Before the war, building a fleet carrier had taken 2 to 3 years just to get the hull into the water. The Navy's own peacetime planners had said, on paper, that no new fleet carrier would join the fleet before 1944. The Essex, hull number CV9, had her keel laid on April 28, 1941. She was commissioned on December 31st, 1942. 21 months, keel to combat, and then the yards did it again and again. 5 shipyards: Newport News in Virginia, Bethlehem Steel at Quincy, Massachusetts, the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, Norfolk, Philadelphia. They built the ships in parallel on multiple ways at once, and as the workers learned the ships became routine. What had been an art became a production line. 32 Essex-class carriers were ordered. 24 were completed. 17 were commissioned before the Japanese surrender. And of every Essex-class carrier that went into combat, not one was lost to enemy action. Not one. Ships took catastrophic damage. The Franklin was torn open by bombs and burned from end to end, and she eventually made her way home. The Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds, lost nearly 400 men, and came home. But the Essex class did not die. They were built to be hit and to survive being hit. And that was a choice made on a drawing board years in advance. That was Tier 1. Tier 2 was stranger, because Roosevelt, looking at the calendar in the winter of 1941, decided the Essex was not coming fast enough. He wanted carriers in the water that year, not the next year. He reached for an idea the Navy's own General Board had already looked at and formally rejected. On October 13th, 1941, the board had said no. Cruiser hulls were too narrow, too lightly built. The conversions would be compromised ships. Roosevelt overruled them. On October 25th, before Pearl Harbor, he ordered a new study. And after the Japanese attack, the Navy reversed itself and did exactly what its own experts had advised against. 9 light cruiser hulls of the Cleveland class, then building at Camden, New Jersey, were pulled off the ways and rebuilt into aircraft carriers. The Independence class, 11,000 tons. They carried only 30 aircraft each. Their hulls had to be widened by 5 feet amidships just to hold the weight of a flight deck. The professionals were not wrong. They were compromised ships, and all 9 of them were completed in 1943, the same year as the first 8 Essex-class carriers, which meant that in a single year, the United States added 16 fleet-capable carriers to the Pacific. 16 in 1 year. The principle was written into their hulls. Something imperfect, available now, beats something perfect that arrives too late. Then came Tier 3. And Tier 3 was Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was 58 years old. He was not a shipbuilder. He had never built a warship in his life. He was a roadman, a dam man, a builder of things. He looked at a problem and saw an assembly line where everyone else saw a craft. The Navy did not want his help. The admirals had a clear sense of how warships were built. Slowly, carefully, by skilled tradesmen with rivet guns. Kaiser wanted to weld them. He wanted to use women, farm boys, men who had never seen a ship before the war. He wanted to build them the way Detroit built Fords. The Navy said no. So Kaiser went over their heads, straight to the president, and he got his yard. 50 carriers, 50. The Casablanca class, hull numbers CVE 55 through CVE 104, launched from a single yard in Vancouver, Washington, between April of 1943 and May of 1944. Do that arithmetic. 50 aircraft carriers. 13 months. Nearly one carrier launched every single week. While Kaiser welded, the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy were dying. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 7, 1942. The light carrier Shoho went under in a matter of minutes beneath American dive bombers. 631 men out of a crew of 834 drowned in warm water. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, 36 years old, watched the ship break apart from his cockpit and radioed back 3 words that became famous. Scratch one flat top. Then Midway, June 4th, 1942. In a single morning, 4 Japanese carriers died. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the 4 best carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the heart of the strike force that had hit Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. All 4 mortally wounded within minutes of one another by American dive bombers falling out of the sun. The carrier crews alone lost 2,181 men. The Kaga lost 811. The Soryu lost 711. And aboard the burning Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 50 years old, one of the finest officers Japan had, made his choice. He lashed himself to the bridge, and he went down with his ship. Now, here is where the popular story of Midway goes wrong, and I want to be careful with you, because you deserve the truth. The old histories said Midway killed the cream of Japanese naval aviation. It did not. Of the pilots aboard those 4 carriers, only about 110 were actually lost. Most of the aviators were pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers, and they survived. What died at Midway was something else. Something the histories almost never mention. More than 700 trained aircraft mechanics, ordnance men, deck crew, fuel handlers, the invisible priesthood of the flight deck. The men who kept the aircraft flying. They drowned inside the hangar decks of the Akagi and the Kaga while the pilots swam. You can pull a pilot out of the sea. You cannot pull a maintenance organization out of the sea. That knowledge, that decade of accumulated skill in how to arm a torpedo bomber at 3 in the morning by lantern, light, went to the bottom with the ships, and it did not come back. While the Japanese counted their dead, an American shipyard was working on a ship they had never expected to see again. The carrier Yorktown, hull number CV-5, had limped back into Pearl Harbor after Coral Sea with serious bomb damage. The estimate for full repair was 90 days. Admiral Chester Nimitz was 57 years old, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, a soft-spoken Texan with white hair and steel behind his eyes. He needed the Yorktown for a battle he knew was coming at Midway. He did not have 90 days. He had 3. On May 27, 1942, Nimitz walked down into dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor in his boots and waded through the drained water to inspect her hull himself. He gave the order. We must have the ship back in 3 days. 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed over her. They worked in shifts around the clock. Welders, riveters, electricians, men who had not slept in 2 days, working next to men who had not slept in 3. 72 hours later, the Yorktown sailed for Midway. She was not fully repaired. She was patched. She was battle-ready. That was all Nimitz had asked for. At Midway, she absorbed Japanese attacks that might otherwise have fallen on the Enterprise or the Hornet. Her aircraft helped kill 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. And then she died there, hit by torpedoes and bombs, and went to the bottom. But she had bought the battle. And that was what she had been sent to do. 3 days on the American side, on the Japanese side, in the same month between Coral Sea and Midway, the great carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku sat useless in home waters. The Shokaku could not be repaired in time. The Zuikaku could not have her air group replenished in time. 2 undamaged flight decks missing from the greatest carrier battle in history. The Americans could turn a wrecked ship around in 3 days. The Japanese could not turn 2 undamaged air groups around in a month. That, in 2 stories, is the whole war. And through all of this, a plan sat on a desk in Tokyo. A wartime construction plan for the Imperial Japanese Navy. It called for 21 new aircraft carriers. They finished 4. Of those 4, only 2 ever put to sea. And of those 2, only 1, the Taiho, ever operated with the fleet. 21 planted with the fleet. We won planned, one that mattered. Kaiser launched a carrier a week from a single yard in Vancouver. The Japanese Empire, across 4 years of total war, completed 1 aircraft carrier that ever fought. The ledger was closing. And, on the far side of it, the men who had warned this would happen were still alive, still in uniform, still giving orders to fleets that could not be replaced. June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was 58 years old. He was tall for a Japanese officer, gaunt, quiet. The last first-rate carrier commander the Imperial Japanese Navy had left. He stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Taiho, and he looked out at the ocean, and he knew, in the way old sailors know, that the day was going to be the worst of his life. He had 9 aircraft carriers under his command, 440 aircraft, 176,000 tons of fighting steel. It was the largest carrier force Japan had assembled since the opening months of the war. It was, by the standards of any other navy on Earth, magnificent. And it was less than half of what was coming for him. Over the horizon, invisible in the dawn haze, Task Force 58 was steaming toward him. 15 American aircraft carriers, 270,000 tons, 900 aircraft. The three tiers were all there. The Essex-class fleet carriers, the Independence-class light carriers, the ones the professionals had said not to build, all of it assembled into a single striking force, more powerful than any naval formation in the history of the world. The Japanese pilots who took off from Ozawa's decks that morning were not the men who had flown at Pearl Harbor. Those men were dead. Most of them had died over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Solomons, month after month, in a grinding attrition their country could not afford. The men in the cockpits now were boys, 19 years old, 20, rushed through a training program that had been cut shorter and shorter as the fuel ran out, and the instructors were themselves sent to the front. They flew into the American fighters, and they died. 445 of them in 2 days. Ozawa lost essentially his entire air strength. The American pilots gave the battle a name that stuck for 80 years. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And beneath the waves, something else was happening. The great new Taiho, Japan's pride, the first Japanese carrier with an armored flight deck, the ship that was supposed to survive the way the American carriers survived, took a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. One torpedo. It might not have killed her, but the shock ruptured her fuel systems. Gasoline vapors spread through the ship. Inexperienced damage control crews opened the wrong valves, and Japan's finest carrier blew apart from the inside on her very first battle 3 months after she was commissioned. Around 1,650 men died on a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. The veteran Shokaku, one of the last survivors of Pearl Harbor, went down the same day to another American submarine. Ozawa sailed home with the shell of a fleet. 4 months later, at Leyte Gulf, they sent him out again. Not to win, to die usefully. His mission at the action off Cape Engano on October 25th, 1944, was to serve as bait, to draw the American fleet north, to sacrifice the last carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy so that other Japanese ships might have a chance of striking the American invasion beaches. He did it. He led them north, and the Americans came for him. The Zuikaku went down that day, the last carrier still afloat that had flown planes over Pearl Harbor. Down with her went the Zuiho. Down went the Chitoses. Down went the Chiyoda, and of her crew of 1,470 men, not one survived. Not one. Ozawa lived. He would have preferred not to. And there was one more ship, the strangest ship of the war. The Japanese had taken the hull of the third super battleship of the Yamamoto class, the largest warships ever built by any nation. And partway through construction, they had converted her into an aircraft carrier. 69,000 tons, the largest aircraft carrier in the world. She would hold that title for 11 years until the United States commissioned the Forrestal in 1955. Her name was Shinano. On November 29th, 1944, 10 days after her commissioning, before she had launched a single aircraft in anger. The anger. American submarine Archerfish put 4 torpedoes into her side. The largest carrier in the world sank on her maiden voyage. That was the summary of the Japanese carrier building program. A magnificent ship on the bottom on her first day out. And when the war was over, the American interrogators sat down with the surviving admirals. They asked the simple question, "What beat you?" Admiral Soimu Toyoda, 59 years old, the man who had commanded the combined fleet in the final years, did not hesitate. He gave the American production capacity. He gave the raw materials. And then he gave the number he seemed to have carried in his head the whole war. Japan's steel production, he said, had been about 6 million tons a year. He believed the American number to be somewhere between 80 million and 100 million. He said the Japanese figure, compared to the American, was almost a negligible quantity. That was the word he used, negligible. And then he said something worse. He conceded that the Japanese Navy had never drafted a plan that had a fair chance of success against the United States and Britain combined. Never. Not that the plans had failed, that there had never been a realistic plan. Ozawa was interrogated too, asked what had caused the fall. He pointed straight at the American carrier task force. Asked about Japan's own situation, he gave 4 words that should be carved somewhere in stone. Our production rate too small. And then, looking back on the whole of it, at the wreckage of the fleet he had led into the water, he said, in the flat voice of a man who has stopped hoping that it was his opinion this war should never have taken place. Which brings us back to the beginning. Because the shock the Japanese admirals felt was not the shock of surprise. The best of them had not been surprised. Yamamoto had told his prime minister in the autumn of 1940 that he had no confidence past the first year. Toyoda had known the steel figures. Ozawa had known there was no plan. They had all known. They had done the numbers in advance, and the numbers had told them over and over that the thing they were watching happen had been inevitable from the moment they began. The shock was not in their eyes. The shock was in their helplessness. The disbelief was not at the American speed. It was at the spectacle of a thing they had predicted with cold accuracy arriving exactly on time, on schedule, ship after ship after ship, and finding themselves powerless to stop it. If you have ever sat in a meeting where you laid out precisely why a course of action would fail, watched the decision get made anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with the facts, and then had to spend the next 2 years executing the very plan you knew was doomed. Then you understand something about the Japanese Naval High Command in 1944 that most history books never quite say. They were right. They had been right the entire time, and being right had saved no one. Isoroku Yamamoto did not live to see it end. On April 18th, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot him down into the jungle. He was 59 years old. He never saw the 15 carriers of Task Force 58. He never saw the Taiho blow apart from one torpedo. He never saw the Shinano roll over on her side. He died in the 16th month of the war he had told Kono he could not win past the 12th. And now, go back one last time to a boy on a bridge in the autumn of 1943. Roger Bond is 20 years old. His hand is on the rail of the Saratoga. He is counting the American carriers stretched across the ocean, and he has just reached 13, and he does not know what to do with the number. He does not know that 8,000 miles away in a room in Tokyo 3 years earlier, an admiral he has never heard of told a prime minister exactly what he, Roger Bond, would be looking at on this very morning. He does not know that the men on the other side of this ocean have not been surprised, that they saw this coming, that the ships he is counting were on drawing boards before he was old enough to shave. He only knows that the horizon is full of aircraft carriers, and that a year ago there were 2, and that he does not have a word for it. The word is not victory. The word is not power. The word is the one he reached for later, when they asked him what it had been like. Awesome, in the old sense, the sense that means close to terror. The Japanese admirals had a word for it, too. They just never said it out loud. They had done the arithmetic in 1940. They had watched it come true, exactly on schedule, one ship at a time, for 4 years. The lesson is not that America was stronger. The lesson is older and colder than that. The system that can lose a battle and replace what it lost will always, in the end, defeat the perfect weapon that cannot. Yamamoto knew that in 1940, his country went to war anyway. If your father sailed on one of these ships, on an Essex-class carrier, on a New Yorktown, on a New Hornet, on one of Henry Kaiser's little escort carriers off Samar, I would like to know his name. Leave it in the comments. I read every one. Thank you for watching.